The man standing at the 42nd floor windows of Hartwell Tower wasn't looking at Manhattan. Not really. Adrian Hartwell was staring at himself. His reflection stared back, a 42-year-old man in a custom-tailored shirt, salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, the kind of face that looked confident in boardrooms and photogenic at charity galas. This was the face of success. This was the face of a man who had everything, except Adrian had stopped liking what he saw months ago. He turned from the window and moved to his desk, where a photo sat in an expensive frame. His wife, Sophie, at 28, her blonde hair catching the sun, her smile warm and uncomplicated. She was wearing the diamond engagement ring he'd given her 5 years ago. She looked happy in this photo. She'd always looked happy. That was part of why he'd married her. Sophie came from money, venture capital money, the kind that didn't require much explanation at cocktail parties, but also didn't demand much attention. Her father, David, was successful in that quiet way that made Adrian's family seem louder, flashier, more important. The Hartwell name meant something in certain circles. $3 billion meant something in every circle. Adrian had everything the world told him he should want. Wharton MBA, corner office at Hartwell Industries, 5 charitable board positions, and a wife who looked exceptional on his arm during the endless parade of galas and fundraisers. He'd inherited a company built by his grandfather and turned it into something bigger. People respected him. People feared him sometimes. People wanted to be him. But respect wasn't what Adrian wanted anymore. 2 years ago, his company's chief technology officer joined the executive team. Her name was Vivienne. She was 34, sharp in a way that made other people nervous, ambitious in a way that made competition look easy. She didn't do small talk. She didn't pretend to care about things she found boring. She wore power like other women wore perfume. The first time Adrian and Vivienne were alone in a conference room after hours, he'd kissed her against the glass wall while the city lights blurred below them. The affair had been happening for 2 years now. Generic hotels in Newark, conference rooms after everyone had left. A car in a parking garage during a company event where Sophie was attending a different function on a different floor of the same building. Vivienne had made it easy. She didn't ask for promises. She didn't expect phone calls or flowers or explanations. She just wanted the intensity, the power exchange, the feeling of taking something that wasn't supposed to be available. Adrian told himself the affair didn't mean anything. It was a release, a brief escape from the performance that had become his life. He never imagined Sophie would find out. Sophie was pregnant now, 6 months along with their first child. She spent her days researching strollers and picking paint colors for the nursery. She was becoming increasingly irrelevant to Adrian's world, which made what he was doing easier to justify. He was a powerful man living a powerful life. Surely the rules that applied to ordinary men didn't apply to him. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. Sophie had decided to surprise her husband with lunch. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and the morning had been rough. The nausea that came with pregnancy had hit hard at 7 in the morning, and she'd spent the next 2 hours in the bathroom. By 10, she felt steady enough to shower and get dressed. She looked at herself in the mirror, 6 months pregnant, her body transformed into something she barely recognized. The designer dresses didn't fit anymore. Her ankles were swollen. Her face had changed shape. But Adrian had been distant lately, and she wanted to do something for him. Something to reconnect. Something to remind him why they'd gotten married in the first place. She'd picked up pasta from the Italian restaurant he loved and driven downtown to Hartwell Industries. It was just before noon when she took the private elevator to the executive floor. She'd done this a dozen times before. Nobody ever stopped her. Nobody questioned the pregnant woman carrying a takeout bag heading toward Adrian's office. The door to his office was partially closed. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what she heard from inside. Vivienne's laughter, bright, genuine, and intimate in a way Sophie's laughter hadn't been in years. Then Adrian's voice, low and controlled. "We don't have much time. My appointment starts at 1. Sophie's hand froze on the doorknob. She should have left. Any reasonable woman would have turned around, called her husband, apologized for the surprise, and driven home to rest. Sophie knew she should have done exactly that. Instead, she pushed the door open. They weren't undressed. That's what made it almost worse. Adrian and Vivian were standing very close to each other near his desk. Vivian's hand was on Adrian's chest, and he was pulling her closer, his mouth near her neck. When Adrian looked up and saw Sophie, his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, then guilt, then something that looked almost like annoyance. "Sophie," he said, stepping back from Vivian, as though the distance might somehow erase what Sophie had just witnessed. "What are you doing here?" Sophie didn't answer. She set the takeout bag on the desk and turned around. She walked out of the office without looking at either of them. She took the elevator down to the lobby without pressing the button twice or moving too fast. She walked to her car, a silver Mercedes Adrian had given her last year, and sat in the driver's seat for 2 hours without starting the engine. She sat in complete silence, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her mind refusing to process what her eyes had seen. The pasta in the bag on Adrian's desk was getting cold. Her baby was moving inside her, small flutter kicks that suddenly felt both precious and terrifying. When Adrian finally called her phone at 3 o'clock, she didn't answer. He called again and again. By the fourth call, Sophie turned off her phone. Then she drove home to the empty penthouse and waited for the rest of her life to change. Sophie hired the private investigator on a Thursday. His name was Marcus Chen, and he came recommended by a friend whose divorce had been handled quietly and thoroughly. He sat across from Sophie in a coffee shop near the penthouse, and she told him everything. About the phone call she'd made but didn't answer, about the woman named Vivian, about walking into her husband's office and seeing what she needed to see to know that her marriage had become a lie. Marcus didn't take notes or ask unnecessary questions. He just listened, nodded, and said he'd have information for her within 2 weeks. He delivered it in 14 days. The folder was surprisingly thin. Sophie had expected something thick, dramatic, stuffed with evidence. Instead, Marcus handed her a manila envelope that felt almost light in her hands. Inside were photographs. Adrian and Vivian entering a hotel in Newark. Adrian's credit card statement showing 3 rooms at the Westfield Inn over the past 8 months. Text messages between them. Nothing explicit, just logistics. "Conference room tonight? Room 1847, Marriott on 53rd. Sophie sat at the kitchen table in the penthouse and read through each page methodically. Each one was a small betrayal, not because of what it revealed, but because of how long it had been happening. 8 months. Longer. The photographs dated back to last July. She thought about her options. She thought about the lawyers her father knew. She thought about the headlines, Hartwell Industries executive's marriage crumbles publicly. She thought about her baby, who would arrive in 3 months, who would grow up with parents who either found a way to heal or a way to split assets fairly. For 6 days, Sophie did nothing but think. She read through the evidence file 7 times. She looked at the photographs until the faces started to blur. She read the text messages so many times she could recite them from memory. And then she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would give Adrian one more chance. Not because she was weak, not because she believed he would change, but because she was 7 months pregnant, and she wanted her child to have both parents present. She wanted to know she had tried everything before she gave up on her marriage. She wanted to be able to tell herself, and someday her child, that she had given their family the opportunity to survive. She called Marcus and told him she wouldn't be needing his services anymore. He didn't ask why. Investigators never do. They know that people make their choices, and those choices aren't usually logical. Sophie packed the folder away and began to plan what she would say to Adrian at the charity gala. The custom maternity gown was delivered 3 days before the gala, and Sophie stood in front of the mirror wearing it, sapphire blue with delicate beading across the bodice that caught the light when she moved. The fabric draped carefully over her expanding stomach, and for the first time in months, Sophie looked at her pregnant body and saw beauty instead of betrayal. She was going to that gala. She was going to look like a woman worthy of her husband's attention, and she was going to have a conversation that would either save her marriage or end it. Adrian came home at 6 o'clock that evening, moving through the penthouse with the kind of energy he only had when he was thinking about work. Sophie met him in their bedroom, where he was already loosening his tie and reaching for his closet. "We need to talk before we leave," Sophie said. Adrian turned to her, his expression suggesting that talking was the last thing he wanted to do. but something in Sophie's voice made him pause. I know about Vivian, Sophie said quietly. I know about the hotels. I know about the text messages. I know about all of it. The color drained from Adrian's face. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed as though someone had pushed him. Sophie, let me finish, she continued. I hired an investigator. I have everything. Photographs, receipts, messages. I could destroy you with it, but that's not what I want. Adrian looked up at her, and she could see fear in his eyes now. Real fear. The fear of someone who suddenly understood that his carefully constructed world might actually collapse. I ended it, Adrian said. I ended things with Vivian this morning. I told her it needed to stop. She didn't handle it well, but it's done. Sophie wanted to believe him. She examined his face, looking for signs of a lie, and found none. But she'd been finding none for months while he was in hotel rooms with another woman. That was the thing about people who were good at deception. They were good at it. I want you to go to therapy, Sophie said. Real therapy. And I want us to go to couples therapy. Adrian nodded. We can do that. After the baby arrives, Sophie said. She decided this while sitting with the evidence. She needed to focus on the pregnancy, on keeping the stress manageable, on not risking the health of her child. Of course, Adrian said, and Sophie couldn't tell if he was relieved or just performing relief. She pulled on her maternity gown and prepared for the gala where everything would change. The Metropolitan Club was exactly what Sophie had expected. Chandeliers casting soft light across marble floors, wealthy people in expensive clothes, servers moving silently with champagne flutes balanced on trays. The charity gala benefited the city's children's hospital, and Hartwell Industries had donated generously, which meant Adrian's name was listed prominently on every program. Adrian moved through the room with practiced ease, introducing Sophie to business associates and fellow board members. She recognized some of them from previous events. They smiled at her with the kind of politeness that felt performative, the way people smile at someone's spouse when they don't particularly care about that person's existence. Sophie was engaged in conversation with the wife of another executive, a woman named Catherine who was describing her daughter's acceptance to Princeton, when Adrian's hand tightened on Sophie's waist. She felt him tense before she understood why. Vivian had arrived. The woman wore a scarlet dress with strategic cutouts, and she moved through the room as though she owned it. Not confident, proprietary. She spotted Adrian across the room, and her expression shifted into something that looked almost like a smile. Except smiles usually came from joy, and this came from something else entirely. Sophie watched Vivienne navigate the crowd toward them. She was beautiful in a sharp way. The way a knife is beautiful. The way a threat is beautiful. Adrian, darling, Vivienne said, greeting both of them warmly, her hand briefly touching Adrian's arm. And Sophie, you look so expectant. Pregnancy suits some women, doesn't it? There was a pause. Sophie felt it stretch. She felt people nearby pause their conversations. Though I have to say, Vivian continued, her voice staying sweet, not everyone manages it well. You've really let yourself go. Adrian mentioned he's been feeling quite neglected. I've been so helpful in keeping his spirits up during these challenging months. Haven't I, Adrian? Adrian didn't answer. Sophie could feel his arm going rigid against her waist. I've actually been thinking, Vivian said, addressing Sophie directly now, about how I might ease this transition for you. After the baby is born, you could spend time with the child while Adrian and I focus on more mature pursuits. I believe a good mother should be willing to sacrifice for her child's well-being. Don't you agree? Sophie saw phones coming out. At a room full of wealthy people, someone was always recording. Adrian's voice, when it came, sounded distant. Vivian, perhaps we should... Should what? Vivian interrupted. Be honest? I thought honesty was important to you. And then Adrian laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an uncomfortable chuckle. A real laugh, as though Sophie's humiliation was genuinely amusing to him. The sound echoed slightly in the room, and Sophie felt something inside her go very, very still. That laugh changed everything. Sophie left without saying goodbye. She walked to the parking lot and called her car from her phone. The driver arrived in 7 minutes, and she sat in the back seat in complete silence, staring out the window at the city passing by. The drive took 30 minutes. She didn't turn on music. She didn't make phone calls. She simply sat and felt the weight of her baby inside her and the weight of her marriage around her like chains. When she arrived at the penthouse, she didn't go to the bedroom. She went to the study and picked up the phone at 11:47 p.m. Her father answered on the third ring, already awake. "Dad," Sophie said, and her voice broke on the single word. "Where are you?" David didn't ask questions. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Home, at the penthouse. I'm coming to you. I'm leaving right now. Lock all the doors." The drive from Connecticut took just under 90 minutes. David made it in his Mercedes with the kind of focus that suggested he was thinking about nothing except getting to his daughter. When he arrived at the penthouse, Sophie was sitting on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by the soft blankets and the mobile and the books she'd chosen with such hope. She was crying quietly. David sat down beside her on the floor without asking questions. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't ask her what had happened. He simply held her while she fell apart, and his presence communicated something she desperately needed to know. She wasn't alone in this. When Sophie finally spoke, she told him everything. The affair, the evidence, Adrian's lie about ending it, Vivian's public cruelty, Adrian's laughter. She told him about feeling like she existed only to be humiliated. David listened without interrupting. His jaw tightened as she spoke, but when he finally responded, his voice was calm. "We're going to handle this," he said. "But first, I need to know what you want. Do you want to stay married to Adrian?" Sophie was quiet for a long time. "I want to co-parent my baby. I want him to be a good father. I don't know if I want to be married to him anymore." "Then that's what we'll do," David said. "I'm calling my lawyer in the morning." He stood up and pulled Sophie into a proper embrace, and she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't powerless. She had a father who loved her more than his own comfort, and Adrian was about to discover that betrayal had a price. Adrian arrived home at 2:33 a.m. He expected to find the penthouse dark and Sophie asleep. Instead, he found her father sitting in his living room in complete darkness, nursing a glass of his most expensive scotch. For a moment, Adrian didn't speak. He simply stood in the doorway, understanding immediately that his world had shifted. "Where is she?" Adrian asked, his voice careful. "Sleeping," David said calmly. "Finally, after she told me what happened at the gala." Adrian felt his stomach drop. "This isn't your business, David." David turned to look at him, and the movement held a terrible grace. The grace of a man who had made a decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. "My daughter is my business," David said, his voice steady and precise. "The well-being of my grandchild is my business. And when someone hurts the people I love, that becomes my business too." Adrian wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that Sophie didn't understand the complexity of what was happening between them. He wanted to say that marriages were complicated, that people made mistakes, that David was overstepping. Instead, he found himself asking, "What are you going to do?" "I'm not going to do anything," David said, setting down the scotch glass. "You are." He stood up slowly, and Adrian noticed that David was taller than he remembered, or perhaps Adrian was just smaller than he'd believed himself to be. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to end your relationship with Vivian completely and permanently," David continued. "Not a slow fade, not a conversation about boundaries. Complete cessation. She's terminated from Hartwell Industries, and she never works in this city again. You're going to see a therapist, a real one, not someone who accepts your charm or your justifications. And you're going to show up for your wife and your baby in ways you clearly haven't been doing. You're going to restore what you've broken." "And if I don't," Adrian asked, though he already knew the answer, "then I'm going to make sure that every business partner, every investor, every board member knows exactly what kind of man you are," David said. "I'm going to make it my personal project to ensure that Hartwell Industries becomes synonymous with betrayal and corruption. Sophie is going to divorce you and take everything that can legally be taken. My lawyers will make sure of it." Adrian wanted to negotiate. He wanted to minimize. He wanted to find some angle where he wasn't completely trapped. But looking at David's face in the dim light of the penthouse, he understood that this man wasn't angry. Anger was a temporary emotion. David was resolved, which was infinitely more dangerous. I need her, Adrian finally said, and the admission cost him something fundamental. I know, David replied, and that's the only reason I'm giving you this chance? Adrian called Vivian at 7:01 a.m. They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Hartwell Industries, and Adrian was brutally direct. It's over, completely, we're finished. Vivian's response was immediate and calculated. I'll go to the media. I'll tell them everything. Your marriage, your company, all of it. Adrian had expected this. His legal team was already prepared. By noon, Vivian had received a document, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, backed by a severance package large enough to make silence more financially attractive than speaking. The number was significant, enough that fighting would cost her money rather than earn it. By 2 p.m., Adrian had called an emergency board meeting. He announced that Vivian was being terminated immediately for professional misconduct. In a company full of people who had secrets, everyone understood what that phrase really meant. But nobody asked for clarification. In corporate environments, plausible deniability was currency. By 4 p.m., Vivian's access to Hartwell Industries was revoked. Her office was packed up by security. Her email was disabled. She ceased to exist within the company's infrastructure. What nobody knew, except those who needed to, was that the NDA included a clause. If Vivian attempted to speak about Adrian or Hartwell Industries in any public forum, she would forfeit the entire severance package and face legal action for breach of contract. She was effectively silenced. Vivian spent 2 weeks in New York, staying in a hotel while she processed what had happened. She'd played a game she thought she understood, and she'd lost comprehensively. She'd bet that her leverage was stronger than Adrian's resources. She'd been wrong. By the end of the month, she'd relocated to California. She would eventually start a tech company. She would achieve moderate success. Her name would appear occasionally in business publications, but always with a shadow attached. Hints of professional misconduct, suggestions of burned bridges, whispers about why someone so talented had disappeared from the East Coast business scene. She would never again have access to the kind of influence she'd possessed at Hartwell Industries. She would never again work somewhere that didn't already know her story. And Adrian learned something crucial. Power wasn't just about money or position. It was about willingness to use resources without hesitation. He'd used that power to eliminate the woman who'd nearly destroyed his marriage. Now he had to use that power to save it. Dr. Catherine Wells didn't have the kind face Adrian had expected. She had the kind of face that belonged to someone who had stopped accepting excuses approximately 10 years ago. When Adrian walked into her office for his first weekly session, she gestured to the chair across from her desk and got straight to business. Your wife and your father-in-law didn't send you here, Dr. Wells said. It wasn't a question. You came here because you're terrified of losing your family. That's fine. That's actually honest. Let's work with that. Adrian wanted to disagree. He wanted to explain that he was here of his own volition, that he'd chosen therapy as a way to improve his marriage. But something in Dr. Wells' expression suggested that she would know if he was lying and that she wouldn't tolerate it. Over the next several weeks, Adrian learned things about himself that he didn't want to know. He learned that his mother had been emotionally distant throughout his childhood, present physically but unreachable emotionally. He learned that he'd built his entire adult life as compensation for that early abandonment, using power and success as substitutes for genuine connection. He learned that he'd married Sophie not because he loved her, but because she seemed manageable, uncomplicated, unlikely to demand emotional depth. You used her, Dr. Wells said during their sixth session. It wasn't cruel, it was just accurate. I didn't mean to, Adrian said. That's irrelevant, Dr. Wells replied. Intention doesn't erase impact. The question is whether you're willing to do the actual work to change your patterns. Adrian attended every prenatal appointment with Sophie. He sat beside her in the doctor's office, listening to the baby's heartbeat, and felt something shift inside him. This was real. This was happening. He and Sophie attended couples therapy on Thursday evenings. These sessions were harder than individual therapy. In Dr. Wells's office, Adrian could maintain some distance. But in couples therapy, he had to listen while Sophie described the pain of his betrayal without defending himself, without explaining himself, without attempting to minimize what he'd done. Week by week, Sophie allowed him back into her life in small increments. She let him drive her to appointments. She let him prepare dinner. She let him sit beside her while she read parenting books. She didn't forgive quickly. Forgiveness wasn't her responsibility. Healing was. Adrian began to understand that real change wasn't about grand gestures or elaborate apologies. It was about showing up consistently, day after day, doing the work nobody would see or praise. It was about becoming someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Emma arrived on a Thursday evening in June. Labor had started at 2 a.m., and Adrian drove Sophie to the hospital with the kind of focus he usually reserved for business crises. He stayed with her through every contraction, holding her hand, and he didn't leave her side for a single moment. When Emma emerged into the world at 8:47 p.m., she was perfect and furious and absolutely real in a way Adrian hadn't anticipated. The nurse placed the baby in his arms, this man who had betrayed everything his daughter represented. Adrian looked down at this tiny human who was now depending on him, and something inside him cracked open completely. He started crying. Not the kind of crying that was performative or controlled. Real crying. Tears that came from a place so deep inside him that he couldn't have stopped them if he tried. Sophie watched him cry while she recovered from birth, and she saw something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not relief, not joy, recognition. True, bone-deep recognition of what he had almost lost. "I'm sorry," Adrian said, still holding Emma, still crying. "I'm so sorry." Sophie didn't respond immediately. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, still processing the physicality of birth. But she reached out and touched his arm, and that touch communicated something that forgiveness hadn't yet, the possibility of moving forward. Adrian held Emma and understood that he had nearly sacrificed his daughter for validation from a woman who had never cared about him. He'd nearly traded his marriage, his family, his child for momentary conquest and the feeling of power. He'd been seconds away from becoming a man he didn't want to be. Emma had brought him back. "We have a lot of work to do," Sophie said softly. "I know," Adrian replied. "I'm ready to do it." He meant it. Over the following weeks, Adrian's life contracted into something smaller, but infinitely more valuable. He learned to change diapers. He learned to wake up at 3 a.m. without resentment. He learned to sit with his daughter while she slept and feel genuinely grateful for the chance to be her father. He learned that redemption wasn't something you earned all at once. It was something you earned every single day, through 1,000 small choices to show up and be present. And every morning when he woke up, he chose to earn it again. The whispers started in September. Adrian had been at Hartwell Industries for 18 months without incident after the gala. He'd implemented new workplace conduct policies, created transparency initiatives, and increased oversight of executive relationships. By every objective measure, he was doing well. But reputation isn't built on objective measures. The gala had been attended by over 400 people. 400 people who'd witnessed Vivian's cruelty and Adrian's laughter. 400 people who talked about it over dinner and at cocktail parties and in golf clubs. By autumn, the narrative had solidified. Adrian was an executive without judgment. An executive who laughed at his wife's humiliation. An executive who couldn't be trusted with company culture. Some board members started asking questions. Business partners became more cautious in negotiations. There was a perceptible shift in how people treated Adrian. Polite still, but distant, as though they were waiting to see if he would collapse under the weight of his own failures. Adrian could have tried to spin it. His PR team offered him options. Blame Vivian, paint himself as a victim of manipulation, emphasize his contributions to the company. All the standard corporate rehabilitation tactics. Instead, Adrian did something unconventional. He told the truth. He called a company-wide meeting and addressed the incident directly. He didn't excuse it. He didn't minimize it. He said, "I made choices that were deeply wrong. I hurt my wife publicly. I allowed my personal failures to affect my leadership. I'm working to become someone better, and I understand that trust isn't something you give me. It's something I have to earn." He announced the new workplace conduct policies, not as corporate theater, but as specific, measurable commitments to change. He created a mentorship program for young executives focused on ethical leadership. He donated anonymously to organizations supporting families affected by infidelity-related trauma. David, surprisingly, became his ally. They had lunch together twice a month, and David shared stories about building his venture capital business on principles rather than shortcuts. He talked about the real cost of cutting corners, the real value of consistency, the real power of reputation built on integrity rather than image. Adrian listened to everything David said. Over 18 months, something shifted again. Not back to where he'd been, Adrian understood he could never fully erase what had happened, but into something steadier. The business community began to recognize that his reformation was genuine, that his commitment to ethical leadership was real. Hartwell Industries continued to grow. Some executives left because they couldn't accept the new standards. Others arrived specifically because they wanted to work for a company built on accountability. Adrian learned that real power wasn't about who feared you. It was about who trusted you. And trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but only if you were willing to do the work every single day. Sophie and Adrian didn't become the fairy tale couple that charity galas required. They became something better. They became real. They had arguments, serious ones. 3 years after Emma's birth, Sophie discovered that Adrian had been dishonest about a business decision that affected their family's timeline. It wasn't infidelity. It was just the kind of casual deception that people sometimes commit when they're stressed or uncertain. Sophie was furious. She threatened to leave. She asked if anything had actually changed or if Adrian had just become more careful about hiding things. Adrian didn't defend himself. He went back to Dr. Wells. He did the work again. He understood that one period of therapy didn't erase a lifetime of patterns. Real change meant constant vigilance. Over the next 5 years, Sophie and Adrian had 2 more children. Each pregnancy was an act of trust on Sophie's part, choosing to expand their family, choosing to believe that Adrian was genuinely different. Emma grew up watching her parents argue and repair. She watched them model the difficult work of genuine reconciliation. She understood by the time she was 10 that real love wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about what you did after the mistakes happened. Adrian attended every school event, every medical appointment, every ordinary moment of their children's lives. He didn't do it for public recognition or personal redemption. He did it because it mattered, because his children mattered, because Sophie mattered. Sophie remained cautious but not closed off. She allowed Adrian to be imperfect while holding him accountable to his commitments. She didn't erase the past, but she separated it from the present. Their home wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, moments of frustration, moments when both of them wondered if they'd made the right choice in staying together. But there were also moments of genuine connection, of laughter that came from real joy, of partnership that had been forged through difficulty rather than despite it. By their 10th anniversary, Sophie and Adrian had rebuilt something that looked nothing like what they'd had before. It was less glossy, less performative, less concerned with appearances. It was fundamentally real. And in a world full of people performing versions of their own lives, real was everything. The business magazine wanted to do a profile. By this point, Hartwell Industries had grown to a $5 billion valuation, and Adrian was being recognized as one of the more interesting executives in the industry, not because of his heritage or his wealth, but because of what he'd chosen to do with both. The journalist, a woman named Rebecca Thorne, sat across from Adrian in his office and asked the question that everyone wanted answered. You inherited a $3 billion company. You've grown it to $5 billion, but your real success seems to be something else. What changed? Adrian had prepared for this question, not by planning an answer, but by living the answer. He leaned back in his chair and thought about how to explain something that had taken him years to understand. I learned the difference between wanting something and deserving it, Adrian said finally. For most of my life, I wanted things. Power, respect, admiration. But I didn't think I had to earn them. I thought my name, my education, my position were enough. That they gave me the right to things I hadn't actually earned. Rebecca waited for him to continue. I made choices that hurt people I loved, Adrian said. And those choices forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. That real success isn't about acquisition. It's about becoming someone worth respecting. The article didn't mention the affair or the gala. Those details weren't necessary. But those who knew, and there were enough of them in certain circles, understood what Adrian was referring to. The piece became a kind of urban legend in business communities. The story of the executive who nearly lost everything and chose to actually change. Adrian's approach to leadership became studied in business schools. His mentorship program for young executives became a model for other companies. His commitment to workplace transparency became industry standard. But more importantly, his marriage survived. His children grew up believing that accountability was possible, that redemption was real, that their father was someone who'd failed and chosen to do better. 5 years after the gala, David and Adrian went to lunch at their favorite restaurant. David raised his glass and said something Adrian would never forget. "I threatened to destroy you, but I'm proud of what you chose instead." Adrian had built his company into something bigger and more profitable than he'd imagined. But the real wealth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the trust his family had chosen to place in him again. Vivian started her tech company in California with capital that came partly from her Hartwell severance. She was talented. Nobody disputed that. She understood technology, understood markets, understood how to build something from nothing. Her company, a software development firm focused on artificial intelligence solutions, grew steadily and attracted venture capital interest. By the 5-year mark, she was moderately successful. Not wildly wealthy, not transformatively famous, but financially comfortable and professionally respected within her industry. But there was always a shadow. Business publications occasionally ran features on emerging tech leaders, and Vivian's name would appear. She never knew whether she'd been selected on her merit or whether editors were interested in the backstory of the executive who'd blown up a major corporation's workplace culture and then disappeared. She would never again work in a company where everyone didn't already know her story. She would never again have the kind of access and influence she'd possessed at Hartwell Industries. She would never again find an environment where the narrative about her could be rewritten. Vivian had made a calculated risk that Adrian would value his company more than his marriage, that he would prioritize business stability over family accountability. She'd bet everything on a single assumption and lost completely. She'd learned that power without integrity is fragile, that leverage without allies is temporary, that playing games with people's families has consequences that follow you across continents. Vivian built a successful company. She achieved financial security. She became a name people recognized in technology circles. But she became a cautionary tale first. Years later, young professionals would hear her story and understand that ambition without ethics eventually catches up with you. That willingness to hurt others for personal gain has a price, that some losses can't be recovered. Vivian never returned to the East Coast. She never worked in the same circles where her history was known. She built a life in California that was comfortable and accomplished, and permanently marked by the choices she'd made. She'd won the game against Adrian and lost everything that actually mattered in the process. 10 years after the gala, Adrian and Sophie returned to the Metropolitan Club. They weren't attending a charity event. They were there for a board dinner, and the irony wasn't lost on either of them. The same chandeliers hung from the same ceiling. The same marble floors stretched across the same space. But everything was different because they were different. Emma was 10 years old now, with 2 younger siblings, Thomas, 8, and Grace, 5. Adrian had asked if Sophie wanted to attend, and she'd agreed. There was no fear in the agreement, just acknowledgement that they'd built something that could survive returning to the scene of its greatest trauma. Emma wore a dark blue dress and looked remarkably like her mother. She navigated the room with the kind of grace that came from having watched her parents model genuine strength. An older woman, someone Adrian vaguely remembered from years before, approached them with a smile that suggested nostalgia. "Adrian, Sophie," she said warmly, "it's so good to see you. I remember you both from that gala years ago. What a journey you've both had." Sophie squeezed Adrian's hand lightly, and he understood what she was communicating. "We survived it, and we're okay." The story of what happened at the Metropolitan Club Gala had become urban legend in certain circles. Some versions were more dramatic than others. Some credited David with far more ruthlessness than he'd actually displayed. But the core remained consistent. A man had made choices that hurt the people closest to him, and his actions had consequences that couldn't be escaped. But the deeper lesson, the one that rarely made it into the urban legend, was about what came after the consequences. Adrian's humiliation had broken something inside him. His loss of control, his confrontation with how his choices had rippled outward, his fear of losing everything, these had cracked open his carefully constructed identity. And in that breaking, something new had grown. Sophie had given him a second chance, but she'd made it conditional. Change was the price, accountability was the price, presence was the price. Adrian had paid it day after day, year after year, without knowing if his payment would ever be enough. It had been. Sometimes real change requires real consequences. Sometimes people need to face the actual destruction their choices create before they are willing to fight for what actually matters. Adrian had almost lost his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, his reputation, his company. In the end, he'd lost only his illusions, and he'd gained a life that was infinitely more valuable because it was real. That was the lesson worth sharing.